Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the South Atlantic Ocean. In 1883, an Australian barrister and politician named John Want came to England as he wanted to buy a yacht. He had already established a large law practice in Sydney and was known to invest in commercial ventures, many of which turned out to be extremely profitable. He was a keen yachtsman, and in 1862, his father had been a founding member of the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron. Mr. Want travelled to the town of Cowes on the Isle of Wight, where he was shown a number of yachts, but there was one that caught his eye. This was a yacht called the Mignonettes. It had been built 16 years earlier in 1867 and was 52 feet long. Even though the vessel was not designed for long voyages, it was still a sturdy boat, and Mr. Want decided to purchase it. However, the only way he could get the Mignonette to Australia was by sailing it there. This would not be an easy voyage, as despite its length of 52 feet, the boat was considered small for such a journey, and the prospect of sailing 15,000 miles to Australia was not something that very many people who Mr. Want approached would consider. However, he persevered and eventually found a crew willing to sail the Mignonette to Australia. His captain was a 30-year-old gentleman named Mr. Thomas Dudley. Surprisingly, he seemed quite keen to undertake the voyage, and it transpired that he had been considering emigrating to Australia for some time. The first mate was Mr. Edwin Stevens. He was 37 years old and a very experienced sailor, having first taken to the high seas at the age of 14. The other crew members were 39-year-old Edmund Brooks and a 17-year-old orphan boy who had very little sailing experience named Richard Parker. First mate Edwin Stevens had previously sailed with Thomas Dudley, and the two got on well. On the 19th of May 1884, the four-man crew set sail from the English port of Southampton, bound for Sydney. For the first 6 weeks, the voyage was rather uneventful. The sun had been shining on most days, and the seas were relatively calm. However, as they sailed south, on their route towards the Cape of Good Hope, they encountered a storm that was accompanied by extremely strong winds. It was now the 5th of July, and although the yacht seemed to be coping surprisingly well in the conditions, Captain Dudley instructed the crew to heave to. This was a way of slowing the boat's forward progress, as well as fixing the helm and sail positions. He did this so that the boat could continue without being steered, enabling the crew time to rest. However, just as this was done, and Richard Parker had been sent below to prepare food, a very large wave broke over the yacht, which washed away the bulwarks, and the Mignonette was pushed onto its side. Captain Thomas Dudley could see that the yacht was in a lot of trouble, and quickly told Edwin Stevens that they must lower the one lifeboat they had. No sooner had the lifeboat touched the water that the four crew members climbed on board, having grabbed what little provisions they could. As they turned and looked back, they watched the Mignonette, the yacht that had been their home for the previous 6 weeks, sink out of sight on its way to the bottom of the ocean. The lifeboat was not particularly sturdy. The boards were only 6mm thick, and it had not been built to withstand the weather conditions in the Atlantic Ocean. Fortunately, before boarding the lifeboat, Captain Dudley had the presence of mind to get the compass from the deck, as well as the sextant and chronometer. Their position seemed quite perilous, in a flimsy lifeboat, adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, with the nearest land, the small island of St. Helena, some 700 miles away. The four men looked to what they'd been able to salvage from the yacht, and when everything was put in the middle of the lifeboat, they all suddenly realised the seriousness of their situation. All they had were 2 tins of turnips, and no fresh water. Captain Dudley was an experienced sailor. He managed to use what little he had to make a sea anchor. This was designed to stabilise the lifeboat, which was very important when the winds were blowing and the seas were rough. He planned to travel west. He knew that by doing this, they would cross the commercial shipping lanes, and it would be their best chance of getting spotted and then picked up. However, it did take a number of days before the crew would agree to give him fabric from their clothes so he could make an improvised sail. If any of them were in any doubt about the severity of their plight, they soon realised when before any of them slept on the first night in the lifeboat, they had to fend off a shark with their oars. For the first 2 days, none of the men ate anything. They hope that the sea may provide for them, but they had no means by which to catch any fish, and it had barely rained, so they were unable to drink very much water. On the 7th of July, Captain Dudley opened the first tin of turnips, and he shared them equally amongst the crew, a meagre ration, and they now only had one tin left. The empty turnip tin would now serve to catch rainwater, if it ever rained. 2 days later, a turtle was spotted, which Edwin Stevens managed to catch and bring on board. This, along with the second tin of turnips, kept the crew fed for the next 7 days. However, they were unable to drink the turtle's blood, as although Captain Dudley had tried to catch the blood in his chronometer case, the winds that day were quite strong, and as the waves broke over the side of the lifeboats, the blood became mixed with seawater. As the sun beat down on them, and they could see no signs of rain, the men eventually started to drink their own urine. Their lips became parched, and the exposure to the sun, sea and wind meant that their skin became sore. In desperation, young Richard Parker drank seawater and became quite ill, as did Edwin Stevens. Their situation had become so serious that after 4 days without food, Captain Dudley raised a question as to whether one of them should be sacrificed in order to save the other 3. Since boarding the lifeboat on the 5th of July, they had not seen any ships, not even a lone vessel on the distant horizon. Captain Dudley said that they would decide on who should die by drawing lots. However, this suggestion caused some disagreement between the men, especially the oldest member of the crew, Edmund Brooks. He was very much opposed to the idea and reiterated that they were in the shipping lanes and they may spot a ship and be rescued at any moment. A few more days passed and the men's desperation and despair increased. Richard Parker seemed to be particularly weak. He spent the days and nights lying in the keel of the boats, and as he did, the talk of one of them being killed and eaten continued. Captain Thomas Dudley and First Mate Edwin Stevens thought that this would be the only way they may survive. They both had wives and children and believed that they needed to resort to such measures in order to be able to live through the ordeal until they were spotted by a passing ship and would be able to get passage home. On the 24th of July, the men had become very desperate. Surely they would not survive another day. Captain Thomas Dudley and First Mate Edwin Stevens silently signalled to each other that young Richard Parker should be killed. They did not believe he would survive very much longer, and killing him before his natural death would mean that they would be able to drink his blood. The 2 men approached him. He was drifting in and out of consciousness. Captain Dudley said a short prayer. Edwin Stevens then held the young man's legs, and as Captain Dudley looked down on him, Richard Parker looked up and whispered, "What, me?" before the captain cut the delirious and defenceless young man's jugular vein with his penknife, making sure to catch the blood in his chronometer case. All 3 men then drank the blood and spent the next few days eating his flesh and bones. Surprisingly, First Mate Edwin Stevens, who had very much supported the idea of eating a member of the crew, actually ate very little. 5 days later, on the 29th of July, a German ship named the Montezuma spotted the small lifeboat bobbing up and down on the waves. The captain instructed his crew to sail towards it, and Captain Thomas Dudley, First Mate Edwin Stevens, and crewman Edmund Brooks were all rescued. Captain Dudley spent the next days writing an account of how the Mignonettes sank and their 24-day ordeal in the lifeboats. On Saturday the 6th of September, the German ship docked in Falmouth, in the English county of Cornwall, before continuing its journey to Hamburg. On their arrival back in England, the 3 men attended the customs house, where Captain Thomas Dudley and First Mate Edwin Stevens entered statutory statements. These were a requirement of the Merchant Shipping Acts when a vessel had been lost at sea. The men assumed that they were protected by custom of the sea, so did not hold back and told the authorities exactly what had happened to them and all the ghastly details of how they survived by killing and eating the cabin boy. However, this custom was just that, a custom, and was not law. The duty police sergeant of the Falmouth Harbour Police was named James Lafferty, and following the statements that were made by Captain Thomas Dudley and First Mate Edwin Stevens, he decided that he should question the 2 men further. The statements were then telegraphed to the Board of Trade, and to the Registrar General of Shipping. Meanwhile, Sergeant Lafferty took the knife used to kill Richard Parker, knowing that this may later be used in evidence. The three men were then detained until a decision on what should happen to them came back from London. However, it was a Saturday, and the decision should really come from the Home Office, which was closed for the weekend. The sergeant decided that he would arrest the men on the charge of murder on the high seas. He obtained the warrants from the mayor, and the men were all escorted to the police station. Arrangements were then made for them to appear before the magistrates 2 days later, on the morning of Monday the 8th of September. Captain Dudley still believed that they acted lawfully by the custom of the sea, so was confident that the charges would be dismissed by the magistrates. However, the magistrate was unsure what to do, so sought advice from the Treasury solicitor. The hearing was adjourned, and the men were returned to their cells. By Wednesday the 10th of September, the case was being discussed by the Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt. After consulting his top legal advisers, it was decided that they would all reappear in court on the 18th of September, but would be granted bail to enable them to spend some time with their families. By now, news of the three shipwrecked men had been reported all over Britain, and the Victorian public were very intrigued by their plight. It was not only reported in Britain, the story of the sailors who ate the cabin boy to survive was reported all over the world, and it seemed that public sentiment very much favoured Captain Dudley, First Mate Edwin Stevens, and Sailor Edmund Brooks. It was reported that when the three men returned to court on the 18th of September, the brother of the cabin boy, Richard Parker, shook hands with them and did not appear to show them any ill will. Attempts were made to raise money to pay for the sailors' defence. Public donations were forthcoming, and the lifeboat was put on display, so for a small fee, inquisitive people were able to view the place where the men had spent 24 days, and where they had committed their cannibalistic act. The case had presented some difficulties, as the only witnesses to the alleged crime were Thomas Dudley, Edwin Stevens, and Edmund Brooks, and as for defendants, all had the right to remain silent. The prosecution, however, decided to offer no evidence against Mr. Edmund Brooks and requested that he be discharged. This meant that at the trial, he could now be called as a witness for the prosecution. The trial opened on the 3rd of November 1884 in the city of Exeter before Judge Baron Huddleston. Judge Huddleston was aware that there was strong public opinion in favour of an acquittal, but the Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt, was very anxious that Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens should be found guilty of murder. The prosecution was led by Arthur Charles QC, and Arthur J.H. Collins QC led for the defence. Both Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens pleaded not guilty. The judge proposed to proceed in a way not used in a British court since 1785, which was by a special verdict. He outlined that the jury would only be presented the facts of the case and would not give an opinion as to whether the defendants were guilty or innocent. That decision would be determined by the judge. The trial would then be adjourned, so an expanded bench of several judges would be able to hear the counsel's arguments at a later date. The most compelling witness was Edmund Brooks. He described the actions of the defendants whilst in the lifeboats. He believed that Richard Parker would have died first, and in killing and eating him, they had managed to save themselves. After the presentation of evidence, the judge gave the jury a binary decision to accept his direction and find the two men guilty of murder or return a special verdict. Without waiting for a decision, the judge produced a special verdict that he had written the night before. He then asked the jury to indicate their approval of the facts as he read them out. He believed that the evidence had established that all of the men would have died if they had not eaten Richard Parker. Parker was very weak and would probably have died first. At the time of the killing, there was no reasonable prospect of being saved, and that there was no greater necessity for killing Richard Parker than any of the other three men. As the judge read out these statements, he took the jury's silence as agreement. Finally, the judge said, "But whether upon the whole matter the prisoners were and are guilty of murder, the jury are ignorant and refer to the courts." The judge then renewed the defendant's bail, and the case was referred to the Queen's Bench Division for its decision. The Queen's Bench Division sat on the 4th of December, and proceedings were presided over by Lord Coleridge, with an expanded panel of judges. a defence barrister, Arthur Collins, told them that the killing was done out of necessity. He outlined that his clients had no option but to take another's life in order to increase their own chances of survival. There were very few legal cases for which Mr. Collins could refer, but he did cite the 1842 case, United States v. Holmes. In this case, the US ship William Brown sank after hitting an iceberg. Crewmen, including Mr. Holmes, believed that their lifeboat was overloaded and in danger of sinking, so put 14 passengers overboard in the cold water and ultimately to their deaths. In this case, the judge in the Pennsylvania court instructed the jury that necessity might be a complete defence, but the person who commits the crime claiming necessity must be faultless and owe no duty to the victim. Mr. Holmes was convicted, but he only received a very short prison sentence and a $20 fine. At the end of the proceedings, the judges withdrew to consider the verdict. When they returned, Lord Coleridge said that the panel of judges found that there was no defence of necessity to a charge of murder. He questioned how the comparative value of lives should be measured. Was it strength or intellect or something else? He also did not think that it was any more necessary to kill Richard Parker than any of the other three men who were on board the lifeboats. Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens were then sentenced to death with a recommendation for mercy. There was a public outcry, and the general opinion was that the verdict was not just. On the advice of the Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt, Queen Victoria commuted the sentence to 6 months in prison. Thomas Dudley eventually emigrated to Australia, where he made sails for boats and was known as Cannibal Tom. He died in the year 1900. The whole ordeal took its toll on Edwin Stevens. He began to drink heavily and died in poverty in 1914. Although Edmund Brooks was never charged, he made money out of the whole gruesome episode by appearing in a touring circus. He was known as the cannibal of the high seas and would eat pieces of raw meat thrown at him by the crowd. He died in 1919. In the brilliant book Life of Pi, published in 2001 and written by author Jan Martel, a young boy is adrift in a lifeboat with a Bengal tiger. The tiger's name is Richard Parker. The book was made into a movie in 2012. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case